Welcome to Feminist Founders, a podcast that explores how to create a more equitable world through entrepreneurship. I'm your host, coach and journalist Becky Mollenkamp. Feminist Founders is a listener-funded podcast. Your contributions enable me to continue bringing you these important conversations without corporate advertising. To support the mission, head to feministfounderspodcast.com and sign up for a paid subscription. The link is in the show notes. Now, on to today's show. Hey, if you are listening to this live or when it came out, then you may be like me and saying, holy smokes, where did 2024 go? It's almost over. And this season is coming to an end soon. We have a few more episodes to go. And today I'm really excited to be coming to the end of this by bringing you an amazing expert in Chloé Nwangwu. She is the director of NobiWorks, which we talk about what that name means. And it is a brand visibility consultancy that is rooted in behavioral science. Her approach to branding is not just about things being beautiful and not even just things being branded as in recognizable and clear for people what you do, but that it is rooted in how do people respond to branding. She's really amazing. And what we're talking about today is visibility for underrecognized brands. And I love that she uses the term, and she's very adamant about using the term underrecognized instead of underrepresented, because these are brands, these folks are people that are certainly represented in the world. They just aren't being recognized for the amazing work that they do. And we talk about why that is and the barriers that create that under recognition and some things to do about it. It's really important for anyone to listen to, whether you are part of that under recognized community or you have some privilege that would allow you to do more to help bring visibility to under recognized folks. So I hope you really appreciate this conversation within Chloé. Hi, Chloé. Thank you for being here and chatting with me.
Thank you so much for having me.
I start every episode the same, which I should have warned you, but I didn't, so get ready, which is asking people what is their relationship with feminism. And it's okay if your answer is you don't have one.
What is my relationship with feminism? I am one. I am an intersectional feminist. My feminist school of thought, I think, has been informed by many teachers, but one in particular is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who is the writer of Americana, Half a Yellow Sun. She's a brilliant Nigerian writer and gave the famous feminist speech, the one that's sampled in that one Beyonce song.
Which is we should all be feminists. Is that it? I'm trying to remember the name of that.
Yes, that's okay, exactly right. And it's sampled from her TED Talk, I believe. Her viral and very well received and like deservedly so TED Talk. I had happened to have seen the TED Talk before it blew up because of Beyonce's admiration, but Adichie sort of speak about feminism in a way that finally put to words the things that I'd been scrambling to articulate as a youth. And so, that's what I would say my relationship to feminism is, very briefly, given the fact that I just now realized that that's a question that was coming up.
No, it's good. And I'm going to just throw out, because I want to fully honor that was an important author and leader. And I also love We Should All Be Feminists. And I know that she's also come under some amount of criticism for having some trans exclusionary rhetoric and thoughts. And I don't know where that stands today. I haven't looked at the most recent stuff, but I know as recently as a couple of years ago, there was some of that. And I hear you saying you're intersectional feminist, and I am as well. So I'm assuming that doesn't align with your beliefs.
No, absolutely not.
Of course.
No, in fact, this is the first time hearing of it. I'm like, oh, okay. I need to go check up on some stuff.
Well, we have to be up to date on what every person is doing and all of that. So in no way, I just wanted to call that out because I am sure that there's someone who will be listening who's going to know that and be like, So just to be clear, acknowledging that, and also there can be things that are really important in informing our thought that person doesn't fully agree with everything we say. So that's also okay.
Yes, 1,000%.
And yeah, I don't expect you to know everything that every person has said about something. So, but I wanted to point it out just for that one person who's listening going, wait a minute.
Hold on. No, thank you for doing that, because that's it actually does allow me to like make my stance on that clear. Like, yeah, absolutely. Intersectional feminist means like a woman is a woman, right? Like
yes. And trans women are women.
And trans women are women. It's none of this. Yeah.
Yes. Wonderful. Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
None of this turf nonsense. No.
And I think it's good. And I like us bringing that up. I just think it's nice to hit up on those things sometimes. So
yeah,
I want to talk to you about visibility, largely branding. That is the work you do. But I think to understand how you show up with those issues, how you talk about those things, it's important to understand the background that informs your brain now. And one of the things I think so fascinating about you is that you have this background of conflict negotiation, of like working with, and when I'm not just talking like mediation amongst people getting divorces, but I'm talking about at this higher level of like working with nation states to resolve the kinds of things that are big, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Tell me a little bit about how you got into that to begin with, and then what made you start to think, maybe this isn't the path for me after all?
Yeah, great question. So I got into international mediation and conflict resolution because graduating from undergrad, I did not know what I wanted to do, right? This is a thing that happens to many a liberal arts student. All I knew is that I enjoyed traveling, and I enjoyed using my understanding of languages and cultures to bridge divides, right? Lots of folks would have said, hey, sounds like you want to be a diplomat. And even at that age, I already had concerns about becoming a diplomat, only because I wondered what would happen if the United States participated in or insisted we diplomats advocate for a policy that morally I could not stand with. What would I do? As a diplomat, it would be my job to advocate for that policy. And so even then, had concerns about that niggling in the back of my head. And so that's why I kind of like stayed away from diplomacy, never really fully pursued it.
And when did you graduate? Just out of curiosity?
Yeah, 2012.
Okay, so this was in advance of 2016, because that would have been, I mean, clearly like...
This was even before this. Yes.
But, and you're...
prescient, wasn't I?
Exactly. Okay, go on.
Yeah. And so I had the benefit in undergrad of being part of a global leadership program. It was the first one of its kind that the school was doing, and I was in the inaugural class. And so they had encouraged us to travel a lot, right? And so I remember my freshman year, I was in Russia during their conflict with Georgia, or like just after the conflict with Georgia. And we'd been doing a lot of interviewing of like professors and diplomats and like advocates and protesters in Russia, even though that kind of thing is like very racy, right? And that was my freshman year. And then my sophomore year, I was in Japan, and I was, documenting dying dialects of Japanese while I was, looking into the neuroscience of aesthetics, right? Like just the wildest things. And then my junior year, I was in Cairo. I wanted to learn Arabic, and so I said, let me go to the country where the colloquial Arabic is the most spoken, right? And that was Egypt. We left Egypt as the Arab Spring erupted. That was the thing that made me go, oh, okay. I've actually just been on the ground to witness the build up to something. I want to be the kind of person who has a say in how things like this turn out. So I graduated from undergrad, not knowing what I wanted to do, realizing that it probably couldn't be diplomacy. And I looked for programs, and I'll tell you, it was late one night. I was looking again for programs, and I had pretty much searched the entire internet for a program that felt like it would fit, right? Like I was this thorough. And yet somehow this program had missed my notice until now. And it was an international mediation and conflict resolution program in Israel. And I was like, well, since the Arab Spring and all like the work that I've done in like comparative politics and all the studying I've done in that, I have wanted to go to Israel, so why not? So I applied, I got in, and I went. And this is going to be a theme with me, but ended up being on the ground during not their most recent anymore, but the conflict before the most recent with Gaza. And again, had that niggling feeling of, oh, okay, I want to be someone who has a say in how things like this turn out. It came up for me again, realizing that mediation was actually the way that I could do that. And I was very lucky. I was very fortunate in this program that I was a part of because it gave me incredible access to halls of power. I worked with various municipal organizations, say companies, but organizations and entities. I was often in the Knesset, which is their parliament. We had access to the Supreme Court. I got to spend time in the West Bank and do my own research there. It was an incredible program and taught me a lot about the conflict in the Middle East, the Israel-Arab conflict, which is why a lot of people turn to me now for advice on how to talk about and engage with that conflict. But anyway, once I graduated from that program, I ended up taking a job with the Anti-Defamation League, where I became an assistant education director and ended up doing a lot of work in anti-bias, anti-discrimination, crisis management. And then the election happened. And my job became as hectic as you can imagine. Lots of bias incidents, lots of discrimination, lots of swastikas and nooses and KKK and Klan rallies and march, like just fielding lots of breaches of trust in communities across the nation. And that sort of thing takes a toll, And so eventually I said, you know what, let me just take a step back. I went like, yes, I have always wanted to be a person who has a say in how these things go. But I think I need a breather, maybe, because something about it being at home, especially difficult. So I took a breather, left my job with the Anti-Defamation League, and eventually, and this is just like one of those random serendipitous things that happens, eventually was connected to a connection to a connection of a connection, like that sort of thing. And ended up being a fellow with an organization called Independent Diplomat. And these were a group of diplomats, basically. And what they did is they worked with states and democratic non-state actors, folks whose needs were being sidelined, like at the UN and the EU, things like that. And our job was to advise them. And so I did that for a while. That's how I got into that world. Like it was not a super circuitous route, but it wasn't a straight path. It almost never is for that realm of work. So yeah, I hope that answers that question.
It does, and I feel like it's almost never a straight route for anyone. I mean, there's a few of us that, at least by the time you go through your entire career, that manage to have that. Like, I feel like that's a thing of a bygone era of this like very linear path in a career. I think it's also fascinating. I think for so many of us, that career and everything you've done with just the traveling and the experiences and the the world events that you were a witness to and then a part of and trying to help with either resolve or manage the after effects. All of those things are so fascinating for so many of us. And you're a brand strategist,
Yeah.
which just feels like, So how does that seemingly 180, although I'm sure it's not, as we're going to discover, there's so much overlap,
Yeah.
but how do you make that leap? Because I think it seems very off. Like, I know you said it wasn't a linear path, but that feels like such a hard right, or this big
Yes.
so to the untrained ear, it's going to sound like,
Mhm.
how do we go from that story to this?
Yeah.
So how did you make that leap? What happened to make you
Yeah.
decide I'm done with this? And then how do you get to branding and visibility?
It's such a good question. And so here is what happened. My work in the international politics set, right? I think especially if you're a mediator, you get into that work because you believe you can level the playing field, right? When you are a mediator, you're a facilitator between all of these really big, powerful entities, right? And your job is to make sure that there are no big actors, there are no small actors, everybody is heard, and that the accord that they come to at the end is something that works well enough for everyone who's there. That's the goal, that's the dream. And I remember the file I was working on at the time was actually on the civil war in Yemen. And the group that had brought us on turned out they weren't even a part of the UN peace process. And this was despite the fact that they were a pretty sizable chunk of the population in Yemen. They were still a minority, but they were a pretty sizable chunk of the population in Yemen. And so this pretty sizable chunk of the population in Yemen was not a part of the conversations that were being had about what the future of their country would look like. And I had a realization that for all I can control the dynamics in these rooms, from that vantage point, I did not have control over who could get into these rooms. And the folks who were getting into these rooms were those who had power could not afford to ignore. That's how you got into those rooms. And so that was a real issue for me. That was a big issue for me because from an equity standpoint, right, like these folks should have been in this room, right? But even putting equity to the side for a moment, from an efficacy standpoint, if this settlement was going to last past 5, 10 years, these folks should have been at the table. And they weren't, because certain folks could afford to overlook them. That I could not abide. And so I asked myself, okay, cool, what tools in your toolkit do you currently have that might address this issue? And I should say that by this point in time, I had been the young person at a nonprofit for most of my career, right? When you're the young person in a nonprofit, you're always asked to like handle the stuff that has to do with tech or being online, right? But I also happen to be a high functioning tech nerd, right? So I had taught myself to code. I built my first computer when I was like an infant, like too young, right? Like I already knew how to do this stuff, and I'd been supporting all these little nonprofits all over the world in the spare time that I obviously had, with their online presence and like building them websites and, visual identity stuff, like just doing that stuff because I could, right? And so when I sat down and I asked myself what tools I had at my disposal, those are the tools that came to the fore, right? So like hammer, nail, like it sort of was that situation. And so I sat down and I asked myself, okay, what can these tools do? What is brand strategy? What is branding? What are brands? Like, what can they do in this scenario? And I eventually realized that the answer to this problem of folks not getting in the door was an issue of brand, right? Brands teach others how to treat you. And every nation state I'd ever worked with up until that point in my career, and any that I hadn't worked with, right? Like every single nation state has a brand. That's why you don't make certain moves with Germany or France, right? Because their brand informs us how they will respond, right? And so what I realized is that if you can shape a brand appropriately, you can unlock access to a myriad of spaces including rooms like this one. And so I put some of that into action and started dabbling a little bit. And I have to remind you, I was a very junior member of this team, right? So I'm not going to take credit for, like, absolutely not. Please, like, disclaimer, right? However, it was through this thinking and the efforts of the other members on my team that by the time I left, this group was in the, we did it. And that's when I knew I was on.
I don't want you to go too far down the story of what you're onto, so we're going to get there.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned branding is what teaches people how to treat you, or how, I think that was what you said, teaches people how to treat you.
Yeah, a brand teaches others how to treat you.
Okay.
Correct.
What do people think branding is?
Mm-hmm.
And where are they getting that wrong?
Yeah. So when people are thinking of, there's so many layers here. Okay. So first things first, when they think of branding, they are thinking of the process of creating logos and typefaces and color palettes and, like messaging, like
aesthetics.
The aesthetics.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Like they're thinking of creating the aesthetics of a brand, right? And so where they're going wrong is this. First, they don't quite have a firm grasp on what a brand is, right? And that's largely the industry's fault, right? There are as many definitions for brands there are people to give them, unfortunately. And that's why that's the case, right? From a scientific perspective, I define a brand as a system of ideas that influences the behavior of other people. Said another way, it's a kind of influential real estate in someone's head. And so when you operate with that understanding of what a brand is, right, then suddenly all of this other stuff that I'm talking about makes a great deal of sense. Then suddenly the idea of branding, right, shifts in focus from creating aesthetics, right, to creating memorable assets, right, that communicate and link back to this system of ideas, and do so in such a way that this system of ideas can continue to exert its influence. That's all branding is, folks. Branding is really just the creation of memorable brand assets at the end of the day. I'm going to take all the pretty words away. It's really what it is.
Sorry, I was muted. What I'm hearing then is it's how you communicate who you are in the world and what you demand of others to how they will interact with you. I mean, it's almost like it's boundaries too.
Yeah, a little
way
bit.
Of looking at branding, but it is this proclamation of who I am in the world and why that matters and what I expect of others and how they will interact with me. Yeah. And then all the other stuff is just supporting that proclamation. But
exactly.
Too many people get focused on the supporting pieces without actually knowing what it's in support of.
No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And don't realize that those supporting pieces, all they are meant to do is serve as, and here I'm getting a little nerdy, little sciencey, little blah, right? But all they're meant to do is serve as memory anchors, right? That's all they are. They're memory anchors for this proclamation that you're talking about, right? So that when folks see these memory anchors, immediately they think of this proclamation. A great example of this is, I don't know if you all know Jake from State Farm.
Yeah, and how he's also evolved, by the way. There's a new
yes,
Jake,
that's exactly right. No, thank you so much for bringing this up. Okay, because I will never get tired of the story. Okay, Jake from State Farm, for those who are unfamiliar, started off with this commercial, I want to say in the 2010s or the early
Super Bowl
late
forever
aughts
ago, yeah.
Yeah, so long ago, right? And this guy is sort of talking in this creepy mouth breathery voice. It's no, it sounds like a good deal. And you're like, oh no, oh my god, no, hate this. And who we presume is his wife comes down and says, who are you talking to at this hour of night, right? Classic setup. Hilarious, right? The guy turns around and in the same tone of voice, he goes, it's Jake from State Farm. And meanwhile, we're all like, oh, that's just his voice? Weird. And she goes, what are you wearing, Jake from State Farm? And Jake from State Farm is an actual person. And he is a middle-aged, maybe, white guy who's sitting in a State Farm office. And he looks down at himself. He goes, khakis? And that was the ad. That was the commercial, right? And they maybe had a brand scientist. I don't know. But I think it did so well that eventually they brought back Jake from State Farm, like years and years later, and they passed the torch, right? They passed the torch to a younger, hipper, cuter, more racially ambiguous, but probably Black guy. And now this guy is in just about all of their commercials as Jake from State Farm, right? And they literally had a commercial where he passed off the baton. He was like, yeah, Jake from State Farm, the actual original Jake from State Farm was like, hey, Jake, like, here are the rules. Like, sometimes they're going to ask you weird questions. It's fine. Be cool with it, right? Like, they actually had a passing of the torch.
That ad. I need to look that one up.
It was so funny.
I always just thought, like, are we going to talk about the fact that we have a new Jake who clearly doesn't look like the original Jake? Like, this is interesting.
Yeah, no. They had an actual ad where they passed the baton. It was so funny. And the reason I'm bringing up this example is because I remember watching a movie or something like that, right? Maybe I was watching someone review a movie or something, and I saw the actor who plays the new Jake from State Farm, and I said out loud to a room of people, apropos of nothing, is that Jake from State Farm? I literally said this, right? That is what you want your branding to do. Jake from State Farm is a brand asset. He is branding. He's one of those supporting pieces. And when people see him, immediately they think of State Farm and all the stuff that's connected to that, right?
Yeah, and that proclamation that he is in support of, I think, is some version of "We're here for you."
Exactly, like a good neighbor. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there, right? Weird memory for these things, but like, yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's what branding is. That's what brand assets are. That's what they do.
And you don't work with the State Farms of the world, I don't think, because your focus is working with under-recognized social impact brands, those people that have been historically marginalized, pushed to the side, not given the mic, haven't had that same... I mean, State Farm doesn't have that issue, right? They're a multi-billion-dollar probably company.
They're doing
right. But your interest is in those folks who have been sort of ignored. And I'm wondering, before we talk about them, because I know that you have, I saw in researching you, that you've lived, worked, and schooled in 5 different countries. You've been 2 conflict zones. I believe you're multilingual. I think you said you're Nigerian. I wonder how all of these pieces of your identity helps get you to that place of saying, I want to do this work. I know you kind of mentioned the experience of that one, the Yemen story, but I also wonder about your own personal identity and how that brought you to this place of saying, I want to bring this work to folks who have been under-recognized.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my personal life is a tapestry of what it is to be an under-recognized leader, trailblazer, what have you, right? Like, just littered with experiences like this. And I think that it's the sense of being visible but not seen, right? Where sometimes you're an only, right? So like you're the only woman, you're the only person of color, or the only woman of color, right? Whatever it happens to be, the only queer person. And all that you're hyper visible and everyone seems to be looking your way, they can't really see you. And any ideas or breakthrough contributions that you have are underappreciated or misattributed to others, right? And I'm trying to think of just like one example when like thinking back on my life is just like a melange of these things. But oh my gosh, I mean, like this is like a small petty a small petty thing, but like I still remember it. I remember I was fortunate enough to go to a college prep school for high school, and one of the languages, air quotes, that I studied was Latin, and that's why I say it in air quotes because I don't count it towards my language count. And one of the professors had this very cool program where in the summer he would take promising students to Oxford, right? To like study the classics and masters and that sort of thing. And Oxford was my dream. Like this, I would die. Like I loved, loved Oxford. And so the idea of this was just like, sign me up yesterday, right? And so I proceeded to be a pretty excellent student, right? I made sure that I got the grades, even though I was inundated by other responsibilities, right? I made sure to get the grades in this class because that was the marker, right? You get at least a B in this class and you are like, you're pretty much considered to be going on this trip, right? So I did, right? And waited for those who were going to be, considered for this trip to be brought up. And when we were, my name was not there. And I remember being deeply disappointed, but being like, oh, okay, like maybe there were just like a lot of other people who had, grades that were higher than mine, right? And so I remember going to ask a really good friend of mine, a young man, who was one of the names on that list. And I was like, hey, like what grade did you end up getting, for this guy's class? Like what did you end up getting? And he was like, yeah, I got like a B minus. And I remember sitting there being like, you got a B minus? He's like, yeah. And you're going on the Oxford trip? He was like, yeah. And again, this is such a small, petty thing, right? But like young, like ninth grade Chloé remembers this, right? That I worked so hard to make sure that I was B plus A minus range, right? Even though like my world was full of a whole bunch of different things. It's very difficult to do this. And this guy, skates by with a B minus and he gets to go on this Oxford trip. What? Why? Why did I mean, like, not that putting all this extra effort into this class wasn't a good thing, right? But I'd done it with an intention and I did it with a promise, right? That the top however many students in the class would go on this trip. And that ended up not being true. So that's, again, one of, like, I'm sure people listening have dozens of experiences like this one where, the standards are one way in public and they are another way in private, amongst other things, right? And this isn't even getting into what it is like to be both an underrecognized person and someone who is trying to be visible for whatever reasons, right? Whether or not that is because your cause demands it or because your business needs it or whatever other reasons there are, right? This is even getting into the well-documented tools out that, and there are tools, but just the getting in the door.
Mm-hmm. It's that not feeling seen, like you said. Yeah. So you approach branding in a different way, I think, than a lot of folks do, because it's about science, right? Your brain science, psychology, understanding social change, these kinds of things. And in fact, you, I think, call yourself the brand scientist.
Correct.
Right? And you're doing this brand awareness work. So how does it look different when you're doing branding through that more science, psychology, grounded through the brain kind of approach than maybe what people traditionally think of when they're thinking about hiring a brand strategist?
Yeah. So I think usually when people are thinking of hiring a brand strategist, they are hoping for some sort of clarity around their brand and clarity around how that brand can or should operate in the world, right? Generally, that's some approximation of what folks are thinking about when they're looking for a brand strategist. When you're thinking about this sort of thing from a scientific perspective, you realize that what you are after is something a lot more specific. You're after behavior change. And that means that the metrics that you're looking at in terms of success, that means just the methods and approaches that you're going to be using are all going to be different, right? And that's because behavior change is a pretty straightforward process, right? Like, I'm straightforward with air quotes, right? But like, there are differences here and there, but behavioral science is pretty clear on how to go about behavioral design, right? And so that's what I would say the difference is, at least just starting with the scientific lens, right? That we're looking to design behaviors first individually and then at scale. And that means different things and different approaches for how we are shaping that system of ideas, for how we are developing and managing the influence that those ideas have, and how we are deploying those things and managing the attention that they garner.
When you talk about behaviors, changing behaviors, are you talking about yours as the brand or the ways people are relating to you, or both?
A little bit of both, but certainly more so the way folks are relating to the brand, for sure.
And how is that different for folks who have been under-recognized, underrepresented? Like, what does it shift the actual way you're approaching branding?
Absolutely. 100% it does. And this is something that I'm really, really passionate about. It 100% does. And that's because even if we have another person approaching brand strategy from a scientific perspective, right? And they too are thinking, hey, we got to do behavior change. That's important because we're all in the business of behavior change, right? I'm sure I'm not the first person who has said that or shared those sentiments, right? But when you are dealing with someone who is under-recognized at the same time, you also then add to the mix, to the equation, to the formula, the fact that visibility is not neutral. And the set of cognitive biases, for example, right, that one may consider in their behavior design process, right? And it's not just cognitive biases. In fact, they're a pretty small piece of it, but still, right, the set of cognitive biases that you are considering is going to be wider when you are looking at someone who's under-recognized, because you are also dealing with the set of cognitive biases that cause under-recognition, right? That allocate our attention in discriminatory ways. Most, if not all, of the approaches that I have seen to brand strategy, even the ones that profess to have some sort of scientific perspective, do not have an approach for dealing with the fact that there are those of us who have an invisibility cloak thrust upon us just because of who we are.
That is, I believe, what you call the invisibility tax. Am I
partially,
right?
partially, yes.
Like, talk to me about how the visibility game, the idea of getting visible, because I think business owners, the people who are listening to this, are people who know that visibility matters. Like, no one can buy from you if they don't know you exist, right?
Exactly.
We know we need to be visible. We know that we have to get attention put on us. And so many of us are really uncomfortable with that. And even those of us who are more comfortable with it still feel like, I hear this, like, I'm the best kept secret sort of thing all the time from women.
Yes.
And then even more especially so from women who are queer or who are Black or who have any other sort of marginalized identity. So,
that's right.
And I think then what happens is we put it on ourselves. I'm doing something wrong. Why can't I just, so anyway, talk to me about how the game is rigged, what this invisibility tax is.
Yes. Okay. This is now where I'm going to unload a whole bunch of stuff. Bam, friends. So Okay. So we have underrecognition, right? And this is describing the scenario wherein you are overlooked and underappreciated as the status quo, right? That's all that underrecognition means. And if you are someone for whom that is the case, you are an underrecognized person, right? I'm willing to bet just about every person listening to this is underrecognized. And underrecognition has two sides of it, right? There's two sides to the underrecognition coin. There is the source, the cause of underrecognition, which are these cognitive biases that I spoke about, right? These are learned brain chemistry. They're invisible scripts in our head that, as I said before, allocate our attention in discriminatory ways. A great example of this is the racial attention deficit. This isn't one that I discovered, but it is one that came out fairly recently. I want to say 2021. And these researchers were able to empirically demonstrate that white Americans are 33% more likely to overlook their Black peers. And that's even when they've been incentivized to pay attention to those peers. So when they've been incentivized, that gap is 33%, not to speak of when they haven't been. And this study was necessarily limited. That's part of what makes it a study a good study. But the reason I bring that up is because, one, it only looked at race as a binary, so it looked at Black and white. It didn't look at other kinds of race. And it didn't look at the possibly likely compounding effects of other identities, right? Of gender, of sexual orientation, of ability, of socioeconomic status, of body size, of age, of, all of these things, right? And so I want you to imagine there is this spectrum of who attention is given to and who it is not, and the proportions in which it is given and which it is not, right? And you fall somewhere on this spectrum. Look at 33% and see that as a sort of low average, right? So those are visibility biases, right? And there are dozens and dozens of those and counting that literally do what I described, allocate our attention in discriminatory ways. And then there's the invisibility tax. The invisibility tax is the extra bit of time, energy, resources that underrecognized folks are made to pay by society in order to be visible at all, and especially to be as visible as their peers. And so a great example of this, again, not one that I am responsible for, is the facet of the invisibility tax called the ambition penalty. This is out of some work by Stephanie O'Connell Rodriguez, and she describes the ambition penalty as being often mislabeled as the confidence gap in women and girls, when really what's taking place is that women and girls, and I expand this to say underrecognized folks in general, understand that if they do demonstrate confidence in the ways that it is recognized in the places that they are in, they will be penalized. And so better not to be penalized and to be accused of having a confidence gap. How many of these have I uncovered?
Well, I know looking at your website, because I was going to mention the ambition penalty, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that is what's typically called the confidence gap, meaning that in the past, we've seen that as, well, women and girls aren't as confident as boys and men, and why? And this reframing of it is so important. But a couple others you mentioned are the validation paradox and reciprocity gap. And I wonder if you could just maybe a little briefly about those.
Absolutely. So the validation paradox, that is, so many of us, I'm sure, are familiar with this. It is when you are validated with a position of power, air quotes, but are given none of the actual power. And so it is a paradox where you are validated and you are expected to be grateful for that validation, all the while you're being set up to fail.
And I just point out one person that immediately comes to mind for this, which is Linda Yaccarino from X. Right? This is a woman who is elevated to this position where it has become very clear that the only person actually making decisions is Elon Musk.
Correct.
And she's on a sinking ship. She's been put into the position where she has the title of the person who should be able to fix the ship, but she's not given any of the power to do it.
Yes.
all, whether we like Linda Yaccarino or not, though the point is, when you say that, I'm like, immediately I think of her and this unenviable position she's been put in. But it happens so often, and I think sometimes we see it as like a tokenization sort of thing that can happen. So I imagine a lot of people can recognize themselves or have at least seen that experience.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this other one that you brought up,
reciprocity.
Yes, reciprocity. Now, the reciprocity gap, and that just shows me I need to update my website. The reciprocity gap is actually a visibility bias. It's not a facet of the invisibility tax. However, it is connected to one. The facet of the invisibility tax that it's connected to is something that I call the reciprocity ransom, right? And essentially, this is, it's the extra bit of resources that underrecognized folks need to give or pay in order to activate a willingness of others to reciprocate, also known as goodwill, right? And this is usually triggered by the reciprocity gap. And so here is what I mean by this, right? Picture for me, if you will, a parent who is making lunch for their rambunctious kids. First thing I will say is that this parent that you imagined was probably a woman. So that's one, right? However, that's not even the most important part. I want you to imagine the collective societal response if that parent was a man, was a father, right? Imagine that.
What a good guy.
What a good father. Oh my goodness. Right? Now put a woman back in his place. See what the reaction is.
No reaction.
None. And what?
You did what you were supposed to do. What, do you want a cookie for that?
Right. Like, what, do you want some kind of an award, a parade in the middle of the day? That's the reciprocity gap, where there are those of us who are at the bottom of the reciprocity food chain, as it were. And what that means is that because society has been in the habit of exploiting us, we are expected to give more and get less in return. And so the reciprocity ransom is talking about that extra bit of resources that we as underrecognized folks are told to pay in order to activate a willingness for someone to reciprocate. And the reason, this is one of important facets of the invisibility tax, because I think it points directly to some of the advice that we tend to get in the online business world, right? Just give value for free, blah, 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 right? You know the ones. And I mean, yeah, of course, if you are somebody who's at the top of the reciprocity food chain, then yeah, if you give value for free, people are going to feel indebted to you. Because you are not someone we are in the habit of getting free stuff from. You are not someone we are in the habit of exploiting. So we're obviously going to be like, oh my God, what can I do for you, father who's created lunch for his kids? What can I do to make your life easier?
So I love it. I don't love that this exists.
Right.
I love the naming of it. And I feel like, because so often with so much of this, what I have discovered when I'm working with people and helping them manage some of the quote unquote mindset stuff that comes up as business owners, which really is not mindset stuff, but it is, because it's not your shit. It's shit that's been given to you, right?
Yes,
but
exactly.
I think it's the understanding of that. It is the reframing or the unpacking to discover, this wasn't a me problem ever.
Yes.
It was never a me problem. It was always a system problem.
Exactly.
So my guess is that so much of the benefit of working with someone like you versus maybe somebody who isn't approaching branding in this way is exactly that same experience that I have when people are doing coaching with me, which is, it is this understand. It's the naming. It's the naming of the thing.
Yeah.
And there is a remarkable freedom and shift that happens when we can name something.
Yes.
Is that, I mean,
absolutely.
I'm guessing. Tell me, what is that?
Yes.
What comes up for you with that?
Absolutely. Yes. No, absolutely. It's one of the first things that happens when people encounter my work or work with me directly. That, you mean it wasn't me? You mean it wasn't me? Right? And yes, especially as underrecognized folks, have been gaslit into gaslighting ourselves, right? Because that's how we survive, right? And so we say to ourselves, oh, I am comparing their tomorrow to my yet, like whatever the phrase is, right? And I shouldn't do that, like, blah, blah. And like, that's not to say that that stuff isn't correct or is not pointing to something that's true. However, it is madness, it is insanity to pretend that the gap in results or in outcome that this dissatisfaction is stemming from, it's insanity to pretend that that gap is not there. And that's the thing that I really want to get at. That's the thing that when folks work with me, they're like, that's really there. This is really happening. Absolutely. And so if you ever have that experience of there's a peer who enjoys, let's say, more environmental protections than you do, right, or privilege, and you both consider each other peers, and you're both, have been in the biz the same amount of time, and you're doing the same sorts of things, and et cetera, everything is the same, and yet they're further ahead than you. You're not imagining that gap. That gap is actually there. It is caused by under-recognition. It is made worse by the invisibility tax. And your dissatisfaction with that gap is completely warranted. And it's not there because you weren't yesing hard enough, right? Like, it's not a personal failing. It is, in fact, a systemic failing.
And the solution, I think, tell me if I'm right or wrong, because my feeling when I work with people is the solution is not to what you just said, yes, harder and play that game.
Yeah.
The solution is to recognize that game is rigged. So how do you play a different game? Because you have to play a different game. You're never going to win at that game because the game is rigged against you. So it's about creating a new game. So my guess then is working with you with branding, visibility, this big picture beyond just, a pretty logo.
Yeah.
Is about saying, how do I play my game?
Correct.
Yay.
And so this is where I guess I can introduce my approach, right? And my methodology, I think, is rather aptly named visibility engineering, right? And the idea is that if you are under-recognized, then the answer is a brand that has been engineered to be impossible to ignore, right? That's the answer. And so in order to engineer a brand that's impossible to ignore, you've got to consider a few things. You have impression management and development, right? Not going to say that that's not important, right? Those things are there. Then you have influence management and development. And then finally, I might say you have something like attention management, right? And so these are the building blocks, maybe I would say, creating your own, that everything that sort of exists now as the status quo was just some person who went through and architected their own, like, rules of play, as it were. And then that thing became the standard and everyone was like, this is the way. And like, that became the way, right? But if that way does not work for certain people, then the answer is to take the building blocks and create your own. And so that is really why I see it as an engineering process, because we are really getting down to those elemental the cellular level almost.
And obviously, in this interview, which we're starting to wrap up, we can't, you can't tell people how to do that. You can't work with someone individually through this thing. But I wonder, is there something you can leave people with that helps give them an understanding of a starting place for themselves, and that also maybe gives them even a little more kind of glimpse into what it does look like to take this approach, but some takeaway for them to either chew on or to actually implement, to start to say, I can create this new game for myself.
Yes, of course. Yes. And so what I would say to that is this, that let's give this sort of thing that we're talking about a little bit of structure, right? I call like these new rules of play, right, that you can create for yourself. I call it your ecosystem of influence, right? That's the thing that you want to engineer, right? And generally, an ecosystem of influence has three architectural pieces, right? The first is your platform, right? And your platform is simply your premise, right? Your premise is, your thoughts about how the world could or should be different, at least in your corner of the world, right? And your premise and and your positioning, right? And your positioning is just how that premise is distinct, right? And here I make a note that I'm saying distinct and not differentiated. Those two things are not the same. One of them is better for the brain than the other. It's not differentiation. Differentiation does not serve you. Distinction does. So that first piece of your ecosystem of influence is your platform, and ensuring that your platform is memorable in the right ways, right? Ensuring that it can be stored in the right parts of someone's memory network, right? That's the first piece, right? Then the second piece is your circle of recognition. And this is just fancy talk for your network, right? But it is your network structured around a specific behavior, namely recognition, right? And so what you want to do with your circle of recognition is make sure it is designed to amplify your ideas in the right kinds of ways. And ideas can be amplified in a couple of ways, in an information sharing kind of way, right? Like, oh, that cat meme is really funny, right? The news, right? And in a behavior changing sort of way. You want the latter. So that's the second piece of your ecosystem of influence, right? Ensuring that your circle of recognition is designed to amplify your ideas in a behavior changing sort of way. And this literally gets down to the structure of your network, like the literal structure of it, the literal shape of it geometrically, like the geometrical human relationships, amongst other things, right? And then finally, this third piece is about motivational programming, I might say, right? And this is the idea that you have a palette of stakeholders, right? It's not just the ideal client avatar, which that's a whole other podcast about that being problematic. It is, and it is garbage. However, I will say no more on the subject, or I will try to say no more on the subject, but you have a whole palette of stakeholders that are going to be required for your success, especially as an underrecognized person. And what you want to do is to ensure that every opportunity you have to be visible to any of those stakeholders is programmed to gain, maintain, and translate their attention, and to do so predictably, right? And the only way you can do that predictably is through motivation. So those are the three sort of pieces of your ecosystem of influence. Those are that's where you want to go. That's what you want to do. And in terms of knowing where to start, I would say that if you are in a position where you feel like you need to become the obvious choice, then you want to be working on your platform. If you are in a position where it feels like you need to become an opportunity magnet, you're already the obvious choice, but you need to be an opportunity magnet, right? So this is kind of like the best kept secret, folks, right? This is where you want to be focused on your circle of recognition. And if you are in a position where you are build towards your visibility tipping point, maybe that's what I would say, right? If you're in that place, then you want to start focusing on motivation.
I think that's wonderful. I think it gives people, if nothing else, I can see people sort of mapping out those three areas and just thinking through what you're doing well or not in each of them. So thank you for sharing that.
Of course.
I have three last quick questions to wrap us up.
Okay.
First is just, what does your business name mean? Nobi or Nabi Works? What does that mean?
Yeah. Okay. So, I have two first names. So, being by Chloé, but everyone sees the N in my initial. That stands for Nladinobi, which is a Nigerian name, and it means beauty in the heart. And most girls with that name, there are not many, but most girls with that name are usually given the nickname Nla which is kind of like Belle, it means beauty. But my family took to calling me Nobi, which means heart. And so that is where the name of my business comes from. Nobi works. Heart works.
Awesome. I love that. I'm glad I asked. I should have
Yeah.
asked in the beginning, but thank you. And then I always wrap by asking people to share a resource. So a book or a podcast or something that has just been really interesting and helpful to you. It doesn't have to be the most profound thing, but it can be something you've read lately or something that was really valuable to you in your own business journey.
Oh, goodness. Okay, this could be so many things. Okay, I'm going to go with the first thing that came to
That's always the best thing.
my mind. And I actually have to reach out to him again and just be like, hey, I mention your book everywhere I go. Like, could I get some love for that? Not money, just recognition. And it is the book Change by Damon Centola. How do I describe Professor Centola? He is a social scientist, a network scientist, and he is the reason that I understand that going viral is not something that is likely or that you want, given the kinds of ideas you're hoping to have proliferate in the world.
Well, that has me intrigued, so I'm definitely going to check that out. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then finally, what's an organization that's doing great work in the world that you would like people to know about and maybe be able to support?
So there's an organization that a dear friend of mine is starting, and it is called Freedom Dreams in Philanthropy. Yeah, I do. Yeah, so it's called Freedom Dreams in Philanthropy, and they're really reimagining what philanthropy can look like, what participatory philanthropy can look like, right? And I think this is one of the things that's been really near and dear to my heart, that when big money is being moved around and when big decisions are being made, usually the folks who those things are affecting are not in the rooms. And that's why participatory approaches to both of those things are so important and so key. And I'm really excited to see what this group ends up doing. But that's the first group that comes to mind.
I love it. It relates back to sort of how we started our journey too in this story. So thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to make a donation when I can, when it's available, and to say thank you for your time. And I want to encourage others to do that. I'll link to it in the show notes. And thank you so much, Chloé. This has been an amazing discussion. We're going to have a little separate discussion. And what I think I'd actually love to talk about is something different than what I said before, but which is about your experience of almost dying from anemia from being part of the hustle culture world. Because I really want to talk about, we didn't get to talking about you running your business. We talked a lot about what you do, and I think it's great. But I think it's really interesting to hear how other people are sort of trying to do business differently and check out of some of the hustle culture, corporate America stuff. And it nearly killed you, so you had to. So let's talk a little bit about that in the bonus content. So make sure you go subscribe to Feminist Founders newsletter and you can get the bonus content. And thank you so much, Chloé. I'm going to link to everything about you in the show notes so people can learn more. And thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me. This was lovely.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Feminist Founders podcast. If you like what you heard and want to learn more, or if you'd like to support the work that I'm doing with the show, please visit feministfounderspodcast.com. There you can find out about becoming a paid subscriber for as little as the price of 1 cup of coffee a month, which will directly support my work. Thanks again, and I can't wait for our next episode.